Thank you for joining me for another Quick Hits conversation. I'm Dr. Robyn. With me today, I have Sara Oblak Speicher, Heather Villa, and Dr. Bob Choat. I want to ask a few questions today. What does it mean to be bitter about something? How would you know if you're bitter? And then what would you do about it? Heather, can you kick us off?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Dr. Robyn. So for me, bitterness is just hanging on to something negative that may have happened to you. It takes a lot of energy. So for me to get over being bitter, I give myself time to process. Usually it's about a day. I give myself permission to be angry, upset, bitter for a day or two. And then it's time to figure out, what did I learn? If I can pull a positive lesson from it, then it's not necessarily a bad experience, but a necessary one. There's always something for me to learn. And then I can use that in the future and really make it into something positive.
I love that. And I just had that experience, very personal, just yesterday.
Wow.
And it was so funny to notice. It was almost like an escalator and looking at it coming up. And I noticed when I got triggered, and I noticed it was like an out-of-body experience. Every single layer that came up was heavier and darker. And I could notice myself just being in an old narrative that doesn't support me, that just feeds my ego and the fears. And it took me a day and good part of the night to just process. In the meantime, also journaling and just doing physical activity, to just getting out of the system and allowing myself to just be with it while also examining the other side of the coin. It's like, okay, this is the narrative that I'm feeding and it feels shitty and it makes me bitter and it's making everybody else around me bitter because everybody feeds off this energy. What's on the other side? How can I get curious? What can I bring in that is more positive, not suppressing what is there, but reframing it and alchemizing that negativity into something positive?
Yeah, in fact, I want to piggyback on what Sarah just said about the narrative, because a lot of times when people get into going from anger to becoming bitter, it's based on that narrative and that story, and they'll even reach out to other people and telling that same angry story over and over and over and over again. And I've had people approach me telling their victim story, that so and so did this to me and this happened to me and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And I can see their bitterness just rising and rising and rising and rising higher and higher and higher. What both of them just said regarding, going back and addressing it and learning from it is very important. And the use of journaling is very, very important, because if we don't look within ourselves, because we have to be self-aware. But once we're self-aware of where this is stemming from, then we can address it and be able to move forward. And as both have said, they both have grown from dealing with it and quickly, instead of holding on to it, instead of letting it progress. I've been there. I've been there. I remember back dealing with, and this is in the 70s, and coming back when I was in the Marine Corps, and people calling me like child killer and all this kind of stuff, all these kind of names, and I became angry and bitter. And it wasn't like today. We have parades for veterans and military personnel. It was bad back in those days, and dealing with that, I could have gone down that rabbit hole, but then I was able to catch myself.
I think what we're saying is, if you're processing it and the emotion stays negative, so telling a story is good. It's a healthy way to not end up with PTSD, being able to go through the story, because every time you touch the memory, it changes it a little bit. But ideally, when you touch that story, it changes a little bit to the positive, not more angry, I think is what we're trying to say, is that if you're telling the story and you still are carrying the anger, that's when you might say, oh, and now I'm bitter.
I just read an article. I forgot. Oh my gosh, her name. She created a Marshall Plan for moms, and she founded the Girls Who Code. But she was talking about the same narrative and the collective anger that we're all experiencing right now, especially women, when we have been fed specific narrative, and that might be tapping into the political sphere right now. It's like, yes, there's this personal radical acceptance and radical responsibility. And then there's also taking responsibility and action on this collective level. And what are we going to do? Because yes, we can help for ourselves, but at one point, no matter how much we're working, if the environment we're in, all this energy we're investing in ourselves, it's just keeping us afloat, just to break even, just to sustain, and we can't even thrive. So how can we fuel that then into something that uplifts us all?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, let me pose a piggyback question regarding like with our current political climate and what's happening in the geopolitical aspects, and people have this fear and everything. How much does control or feeling a lack of control add to that sense of being bitter?
Mm.
That's a good question, but I feel like that's part of the answer as well. To get over that bitterness, you still need to look at yourself and say, what could I change? That's the only thing you can control. So it's typically not an ideal situation, but I can point out one or two things, whether it's my reaction or more I could have said, different questions I could have asked, or even following up with that person that made me feel that way. There's always something more I could do, and that's where I find my control.
Yeah.
Well, and something that I've noticed is that when I do take control and I start setting boundaries, that's when people start calling me bitter. Have you observed that in any way?
Yeah, I think it's probably that person, or when people say that, it's
Yeah.
their own projection. It has nothing to do with you. It's
Mm.
it's maybe a trigger that's happened within them, and they're projecting their anger and their bitterness onto you, and so it's something they have to address.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. Setting boundaries is easy. It's upholding them when you get a pushback from others.
Mhm.
That's where the work starts.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And I feel like for me, how would I know I was bitter? Because this is a question I've asked myself when someone has said to me, "Oh, you're just bitter." I'm like, I don't think I'm bitter. I don't. So asking myself that question, what does bitterness look like? I think what we're saying is it looks like rumination and anger and that stuff, and not so much around this happened and I'm setting boundaries. That doesn't make me bitter.
Yeah.
Right.
I
But
think
living and dwelling on whatever happened, that's where you become bitter. If you can't move on, find something to move past it, I see that as bitterness.
yeah.
Mm.
And I think when you know yourself, it's like, you know, when you're not being you know, when you're holding up to something that's heavy, because your truth, it's light, it's warm, it lights you up.
Mm.
Anything heavier, it's like, okay, let me examine that, because I don't think this is really mine.
Is bitterness something that has a time limit on it, or is it something that you can, if you don't be careful, carry for years?
Absolutely, it's something that can be carried, because if like any other emotion, especially an intense emotion, it can actually grow. And we hear about people and families, and if you remember the famous feud back in the Smoky Mountains, what was the
Hatfields and
Hatfield
McCoys?
McCoy
McCoys,
feud?
yeah.
Yeah. So if you remember that, it was something that was like passed down from family to family, generation to generation, and the bitterness just grew and grew and grew.
Mm.
And so it's something that can be passed on. They don't even remember the original incident,
Mm.
but it's the feeling that they're holding with their own body that has grown.
Yeah. You know, if you're into cartoons, I have little ones at home, so I'm up to speed with all the Disney cartoons right now. I would really offer, if you want to look into bitterness and how it translates through generations, Coco, Encanto, and Turning Red are beautiful
Mm.
cartoons that really address the topic.
Interesting. Interesting. I do feel like bitterness is one of those things that we don't talk about as adults, maybe as much as we should, like understanding that emotion and what it means.
Yeah.
I talk a lot when I work with clients about feeling words, and I don't think bitterness is one that I bring up. So I think I need to add that to the list. So thank you so much for having this conversation with me. That is our 10 minutes. It has been really useful, and I look forward to speaking to each of you again really soon.
Thank you.